Ahoy! Surviving the early laning phase in Deadlock isn't easy, and there are items that can help you with that. And I know this is often said as kind of clickbait, but the results of this genuinely surprised me as well. I was going into this not knowing what to expect, not knowing what kind of items would actually be good for surviving the laning phase, and I found some results that were completely against what I thought would be the strongest options. Little disclaimer, this video will contain a fair few numbers, and while some of you will be very excited about that, others may not so much. I will simplify everything so that you just get a very basic overview of which items will be useful for you. When you're ahead and you have a lot of pressure in lane, you have many other options that you can go into as well, but the situation for me is often that I am getting pressured out by players that are simply better at aiming, and I like to test different options that can help me survive in those situations. Our first vitality item is extra regen. Like all green tier 1 items, this comes with plus 11% base health, and this is going to factor in our calculations. It comes with 2.8 health regen, which is the highest flat amount that you can get at this point of the game. Also 8 ammo and 25 bonus health. So this is the primary regeneration option and kind of our marker for our other items performed. This is our baseline. Sprint boots comes with 2 sprint speed as well as 4 weapon damage and 1 health regen. So significantly less regen and some other utility instead, but obviously still a regen option. Enduring Spirit has 75 bonus health, 8% Spirit Lifesteal and 4 Spirit Power. This is very difficult to compare to the others because it entirely depends on how much damage you're doing, and it also means that it scales with your damage. So the more damage you get by leveling up, by getting more items, the more this will heal. It also scales with the amount of enemies that you hit and the amount of enemies that are around, so again, very difficult to overall quantify. Extra health only comes with 160 bonus health and 5% weapon damage, so you may be wondering why I put this into survivability and sustain options, but this bonus health alone can have a lot of inherent value when you compare it to items that have less bonus health and have regeneration instead, like for example sprint boots. This would take 160 seconds to reach the same survivability as extra health would, and then maybe in that time span you could back and heal up to full as well. Healing Rite is currently often seen as the staple for survivability when you're getting pressured out of lane too much. It comes with 45 bonus health as well as an active effect, which gives you regeneration and sprint speed. This total regen is 370 across 17 seconds. And on top of that, you have the 2 sprint speed. What's important to note here is that this gets dispelled completely if you take damage from enemy players or objectives, but not from minions, so you have to position very carefully during these 17 seconds. Melee lifesteal comes with 15% melee damage and 75 bonus health, but your melee attacks also heal you for 20% of the melee damage dealt plus 90, and the plus 90 flat value is the more important part here. This heal is 40% effective versus non-heroes, so versus minions, creeps of any kind, including the jungle. Speaking of the jungle, monster rounds is plus 35% weapon damage versus all NPCs, and also plus 35% bullet resist against all NPCs, meaning that the minions in lane will hit you for a little bit less if you choose to aggress forward, maybe onto the enemy player and he's somewhat behind the minions. On top of that, you get 50 bonus health and 1 health regen. Restorative Shot gives you 7% bullet resist and 8% weapon damage, a little bit of survivability there through the bullet resist, and your next bullet will heal you based on what target you hit, with 35 healing from heroes and 10 healing from NPCs. This has a 6 seconds cooldown, so you get significantly higher value from heroes here. In Spirit, we have Extra Spirit, which provides you with 8 Spirit Power, 1 health regen and 35 bonus health, as well as Spirit Strike, which comes with 100 Spirit Shield health. We're going to treat that as normal health here because I would say normally you're going to get hit by at least 100 Spirit damage, and also it regenerates quicker than normal health, so actually it might be more in some situations. Along with that, 1 health regen and 15 melee damage, or 15% melee damage. Your melee attacks also deal extra Spirit damage and reduce the target's Spirit resist. Now before we get started, I'm quickly going to show you a full overview of the graph, but I will tell you that there are many things here that are not as they seem, so we're gonna have to go into the details and talk about all this. If you're enjoying the video so far, you would massively help me out by maybe subscribing, clicking the bell, clicking the like button. It helps a ton when it comes to growing it in Deadlock. I would very much appreciate it. So what are we looking at here? I'm going to use extra regen as an example because it's relatively straightforward. First of all, we have the HP that this item provides. That is 2.8 HP. And the cooldown or interval of that is once per second. There's some items later that don't work that way. That's why it's important to establish this early on. That results in 2.8 HP per second. Again, very straightforward. Along with that, extra regen has 25 flat health, and it has an 11% health increase. We already talked about that. This results in this health value if we assume 600 base health. Not every character in the game has 600 base health. Some have more, some have less. Calvin hits 600. Calvin is a good middle ground both in base health and in base regeneration, so I chose that value. This can vary from character to character. The overall outcome will shift slightly, but not massively. This is just the increase that we receive from the flat health as well as the percentage health. However, we can add the HP per second on top of that. What we need to do is decide what time span we want to see. And what we're going to go with first is 3 minutes. If you're getting poked across 3 minutes in lane, then your overall health pool that would be available through the sustain plus your base health and everything else that you have would be this. So this is simply your total health plus this times 3 minutes. That would be nearly 1,200 total health available. That is our baseline, and this is what we're going to look at with other items as well. I have made some additional comparisons that kind of show different time spans or factoring in base regeneration as well, and I will show you these. So first of all, we have an option where we're using the total health again as well as the HP per second for 3 minutes, but also 2 base regen and also for 3 minutes, of course. This can show us if the base regeneration has any impact on the overall value of an item, because this is something that characters inherently have. Again, not the same on every character. Some have 1 base regen, some have 3. This is just the average baseline of 2. Next, I wanted to see if taking out the base value of 600 health changes anything. So we're just looking at the added health and all the sustain that we're getting, again, across 3 minutes. This will be the results here. And then, last but not least, we have the added health times 3, plus our HP per second, plus our 2 base regen for 10 minutes. This is essentially the entire laning phase. The reason why I added health 3 times here is because if you are going back to base, then this added health would be regenerated every single time, and that would add to your overall health pool. So this assumes going back to base 3 times or being able to fully regenerate in lane at some point, where you get value out of having more health as a pool, but you don't get more value out of just having more regen because you're already at full health at that point. So there are many different ways that we'll be able to look at these numbers, and you could do different calculations, get different angles, but what you'll find is that the overall pattern stays relatively consistent. I've kind of color-coded that, and you will see what I mean in just a second. We're primarily going to focus on this value as the one that I think is relatively comparable, where we want to see what other items bring in terms of performance. So in this case, that is the added health, not the total health, plus the HP per second for 3 minutes, along with the 2 base regen. And with extra regen, we're starting here at 955 or almost 1,000, and that's our yellow middle ground. Sprint boots, very unsurprisingly, drops lower because it's only really a little bit of sustain. That is 606 between the regeneration and the percentage health, which is one of the lower numbers, while not quite the lowest. Monster rounds is slightly lower than that, but with 590. That's because it doesn't come with percentage health, so you're losing a little bit of extra. Again, not the biggest deal, because in Monster Round's case, you also get the 35% bullet resist versus NPCs, which means that effectively this item likely has much more survivability than you would get from this number. I would say maybe if you're absorbing just a little bit from the minions overall, you could end up with an extra 150 health at some point, and that would obviously not be reflected here without further adjustments. So I think Monster Rounds, not the worst in survivability, not just based on this number, but also not better than, say, extra regen. During Spirit, I will say again, it's incredibly difficult to find fair numbers for. I did a full flame dash as well as Inferno's 1 on a minion wave and hit all of the minions. and usually ticked between 8 to 9 to 10 health, but then in some situations it also ticked a little bit higher to 12. So very, very conditional, very difficult to place, depends on so many different factors. This result here ended up with 573. This could be much higher, especially when you're getting later into the game and you actually get more damage items. So this carries over better into late game, but I believe purely as an early sustain option, it is not the greatest. It is good enough. It's a green item after all with some flat health and some percentage health, but the sustain is not monstrous by any standards, and that's also not its job really. Again, gets better late game is something you can carry much further than some of the other items here, though most people end up selling it for higher tier lifestyle anyways. Extra Spirit, 575, minimal sustain along with a low flat health value. No surprise here, it doesn't really add very much sustain, it's just a little bonus, and that's not what the item is for anyways. Extra Health actually comes in a similar territory with 586. The flat values alone just aren't enough to carry it, even though it's okay, it just doesn't come out quite on top. And in certain other scenarios, like the longer the test goes, the more it falls off. So it's not really built for this once again. But it's okay. Extra health is clearly there to have extra health and not to be a sustain item. Spirit Strike actually comes in with a decent value here of 640 due to the 100 Spirit Shield. If you don't want to factor in the Spirit Shield, then this value would be lower, but I do believe that is a pretty important factor, again, especially because it can regenerate independently. And that brings us into more significant sustain territory. These are items that have special effects and needed multiple comparisons rather than just a simple overview like the others. The first one of those is Healing Rite. I first tested that without its cooldown just to have an approximation of how much HP per second this provides during the effect itself, which is almost 22, but this is something we can't put in the comparison because obviously the other tests are across 3 minutes, 10 minutes, where you would have to factor the cooldown in. With its cooldown factored in, with the full cooldown, we're looking at 6.2 HP per second across a whole minute, but it's just delivered as a burst up front, basically. Not really a burst, but a quicker heal up front, and then you have it for the rest of the minute. So it's a bit different in how it works, but the overall result is that we end up with 1,581 sustain across 3 minutes plus added health, which is 1.5 times what extra regen is. This sounds very, very strong, but this is also a little bit misleading. First of all, this only works as long as you're not getting hit. And that likely means that in order to get the full effect, you're going to have to miss out on creeps. Or you're going to have to position so far back that you may lose more than just some creeps. You may lose structure for this. Because you just have to be so far away from the enemy that they cannot take your Healing Rite off you. And the duration it takes for is so long that it's almost the entire timer of a wave spawn, which is 25 seconds. So unless you can like instantly burst all the minions and run far away and immediately pop it on you and then be back for the next wave, this is likely not going to be the numbers you're seeing across a game in general. I think a number closer to that of extra regen is much more realistic. Again, depending on the exact circumstances. What is really good about Healing Rite is that you get it when you need it the most. You can pop it and decide, okay, now is the moment that I need the more survivability, movement speed and everything effect. Give me that for the next couple seconds and I'll be fine. And obviously that's something that the other items here don't offer. Another benefit is that you can use this on a teammate as well, which can give it a lot more value, especially in duo lanes, where it's okay if one player backs off and the other one at least gets the farm still. So the pressure doesn't completely evaporate the moment you pop this. And that can kind of give it more of a purpose, especially on support-focused characters as well that maybe you want to build into the upgrade at some point. Now we're getting into very spicy territory, and that is melee lifesteal. Melee lifesteal is one of the most fascinating effects in terms of how it played out here, but it's also one of the difficult ones to execute. So there's 2 values here for light melee and 2 values for heavy melee, because it actually scales with that. The light melee value, the first one here, is 41. This is a light melee attack, again, with Calvin, but also with other characters. It's not really that relevant which character you're playing early on, unless you have like a lot of items going very quickly, because a lot of the initial healing comes from the flat 90 value, which is then multiplied by 40% against NPCs, and not so much from any additional effects beyond that or whatever your character offers. So this is what you're kind of working with. The light melee versus heroes, on the other hand, heals for 105. The heavy melee versus NPCs heals for 47, and the heavy melee versus heroes heals for 116. So you can see the gap between light melee and heavy melee isn't that big, so if you want to reliably and quickly get it off and not worry about getting parried out of it, then generally a light melee is probably a more consistent option and guarantees more last hits as well because it's a quicker animation. So yeah, use depending on how you prefer. But what's really important here is the values that we can achieve. This is 1,555 for light melee lifesteal versus NPC. So this is the lowest possible value, assuming we're hitting this on cooldown. We'll get back to that in a second. If we're hitting this against heroes, we're looking at 3,201. So what you can see here is double the sustain of Healing Rite when used on cooldown. And you're not necessarily even using Healing Rite on cooldown. And likewise, if we go even further, then in heavy melee lifesteal we can get up to 1,710, or versus heroes we can get up to 3,484. Now, you are likely not going to reach these values. That's because this is a melee sustain item, and that's where its biggest problem lies, because you need to melee something. That means you either have to have minions around, or a willing enemy player that wants to get hit in the face, or at least a jungle camp, and if you're going for jungle creeps, then you're also taking more damage from those creeps in return, so you're technically losing sustain, unless you were planning to go for them anyways, no matter if you had the item or not. So realistically, we probably have to halve this value roughly, and say we hit maybe 2 creeps per wave with a melee, and then maybe we hit a third one occasionally, but we also have to walk up for that, and we take damage in return, get poked out a little bit, and it kind of evens out. At that point, we're looking at like 750-ish sustain, and that I think is a more realistic window. It of course depends a lot on how much the enemy is willing to get close to you and give you this kind of healing here. Those traits would very easily increase your heal, but then also you have to hope that your cooldown on the melee is up in that very second, which is not always going to be the case. It also makes it very clear that the best way to deny someone who is melee lifesteal the sustain is simply to not go into melee range, and you can kind of just chop away at their health because the sustain without it is going to be significantly lower. But if you're playing a melee heavy hero, or you have a very melee focused playstyle when it comes to securing creeps, then I do believe that light melee lifesteal especially, but also melee lifesteal in general, is fairly slept on. It's not really often regarded on the same level as some of these other sustain options, and I do believe that with the exception of maybe extra regen, it can keep up with most of them very well and can be considered in quite a few situations. You may notice that the color scale does kind of stop at 1555. That's because I'm using this as the max value, because I think this is already somewhat unrealistic to actually reach, but it's kind of on the level of Healing Rite and cooldown. Whereas these numbers afterwards, you're realistically not actually going to end up reaching, but rather they're hypotheticals of how the item would work if it was completely maxed out, which you're not going to do. There is another option, and that is Restorative Shot. Restorative Shot gets us 660 when used against creeps, because the value against creeps is very low. So not exactly ideal. However, when Restorative Shot is used against heroes, then the same sustain here results in 1410 health, which is almost on the same level as melee lifesteal. Now, this is something that you're also not going to achieve, because you'd have to hit the enemy hero consistently every 6 seconds and never proc this on minions in between, which is fairly unrealistic. But seeing how this value is relatively achievable, I would say, just consistently shooting minions, and then maybe in between you get some shots on heroes anyways, so you will get somewhat close to this. I think the overall sustain of Restorative Shot is significantly better than some of the other sustain options that rely purely on HP per second, just because the potential to heal for more is definitely there. This is especially true if you're able to combine multiple items. So for example, you could use the melee lifesteal to punch the minions, and then in between you fire shots at the enemy player with Restorative Shot and get kind of a min-maxing from that, get the most sustain possible from shooting the enemy player as often as possible. Or you can use abilities to clear to proc this more often, where you could, for example, compare this to Lifesteal then, like Enduring Spirit. Again, not necessarily a representative value and it scales up, but I would much rather have Restorative Shot and use some Spirit abilities to clear the wave and then shoot the enemy player to get more sustain from that, than try to rely on the sustain that I'm getting from the abilities. Of course, Enduring Spirit absolutely has its place. Characters like Lady Geist, for example, might enjoy it a lot, but I think Restorative Shot is just, when we're purely looking at sustain options, very, very appealing here. So generally, I would say if you're just after sustain, Extra Regen is definitely a very good baseline. It is well tuned to the point where I would say, yep, that gives you good sustain, that gives you good survivability overall. That's obviously also very defensive. And I do think that, especially if you're an aggressive melee character, melee lifesteal is absolutely an option worth considering. And in general, Restorative Shot is very much an option worth considering as well. If you want to play a little bit aggressive at least. If you're purely focusing on last-hitting minions, then it's probably not the way to go. If you're purely focusing on last-hitting minions, I would opt towards monster rounds anyways. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that you can combine multiple items here as well, of course. So for example, if you're getting monster rounds and you're saying, okay, at some point later, I want to get sprint boots, so I'm going to get those anyways, and I need a little bit more sustain in lane, then you might as well buy monster rounds and just buy sprint boots a little bit earlier, and you get okay sustain out of that. It's not quite extra regen sustain, it's 836, but it's definitely enough to tide you over, and that will just be sufficient until you can kind of hold your own clear quickly enough that sustain isn't really your main concern. Last but not least, it's absolutely worth keeping in mind that the banner minion, the green minion in lane, that gives you that little tether, also heals you for 1560 if you were constantly tied to it. That's obviously not going to happen either, but it heals you for 40 per tick on early levels with a 6 seconds cooldown, so you can get at least an easy 80 health out of that, sometimes more. So that's going to significantly impact your sustain, sometimes be worth more than any of the items that you could get. So you should position accordingly and try to benefit from that sustain whenever this minion is close. If you're getting very heavily focused in lane and you feel like Healing Rite is something you won't really consistently get off, then I think the most reliable option is getting extra regen, just because it's consistent and it's a lot, and also provides some survivability, along with monster rounds, so you can reduce the damage you take from the minions, you can deal more damage to them, so even if you're getting pressure on tower, you can clear them as quickly as possible, and you have a little bit of additional sustain through them. There are other pathways that you can choose, of course, and again, if you're able to play more aggressive, there is all this down here, but I think those two items really give you a significant amount of early survivability and mitigation until you can do better. For melee, you can also see that you can get the melee lifesteal, of course, and you can also get Spirit Strike along with that, which will give you that additional shield which regenerates independently and some additional sustain. So I think just going into multiple melee options early on is actually surprisingly good. I hope this will give you a decent overview and help you with the decision what kind of sustain you want to go for and what can help you in early game. In the next days, we'll also be talking about how to survive the early lane itself when things are not going that well. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when it comes out, or if you're interested in my upcoming key bindings videos as well. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Dukesloth, out.